Good afternoon, Professor. Mr. Connell?
Thank you, Lord. During the lunch break, Professor, we've been trying to find out what the GGC review of cases that you mentioned in paragraph 192 of your witness statement might be. We weren't sure whether we had it or whether we didn't have it. We think it might be a document I'm about to show you. So can we have bundle 4, page 190, please? This, I believe, is a document primarily organized by Pamela Ioannidis. Is this the document you were referring to that's got several pages?
No.
No?
The document I was referring to was a root cause analysis of 99 cases, which was done by Pamela Ioannidis after she had, excuse me, retired. And there was discussion at the time about how useful it would be for the inquiry, because it had a lot of information that was thought to be you had prior. So it may be that you haven't been sent it.
Right, because this appears to be a root cause analysis.
Yes.
Or at least that's what it's called. And then about halfway down that first page, we see this analysis still requires the input from microbiology and expert clinician. So the authors, who I think maybe Ms. Ioannidis and some with assistance with some others, seem to think it was a sort of provisional document. So this is not something that...
No, the other one is more comprehensive, and as I say, the title's got 99 cases on it. I can point CLO to it, or our PMO will know this document well.
And in any event, it's a document that was known to exist, but was thought not necessarily to be helpful to the inquiry. Is that right?
Indeed, until I quoted it.
Yeah. Another point where we're at it. Can I have bundle 1, page 325? It's just that you were critical, I think, of IMTs always looking for a source in the environment, and I've been referred to this IMT minute, which, as you'll see, was one chaired by Dr. Inkster, and at the foot of that page, near enough, we see of the 2 HIE cases, I assume one is possible gut source. So it would appear, at least under the chairmanship of Dr. Inkster, the IMTs were looking at both environmental and gut sources.
It looks like that.
Thank you. Now, the other thing before I move on, that I need just to ask you about, in the course of your evidence, you've provided, initially without referring to it, and then when we unearthed it, the graph prepared by Ms. Harvey-Wood, and well, it's actually Ms. Harvey-Wood and Dr. Peters. There's no discussion of that graph, I don't think, in your witness statement.
There's not. I wasn't aware of that graph until it was put into my bundle last night or yesterday.
So that the first time that it occurred to you to comment on it?
It's the first time I'd seen it.
It's just that no one has previously suggested the issues that you've raised with it at any earlier stage of the inquiry, so we wondered where it had emerged from.
My head.
Just you thought of it last night?
No, I thought of it before, but the evidence was there before me to point to.
We'll try to work out how to deal with the fact that no one else has had a chance to look at that point that you've just raised. Can I ask you about some other matters? Hopefully not too many before we get to the whole genome sequencing issue. I just wanted to ask you briefly about Cryptococcus, acknowledging, of course, that I'm not going to ask you questions about ventilation ducts and so on, because that's not your sphere of expertise. You did have an involvement in an IMT of the 2nd of July 2020, where there was a suggestion of Cryptococcus as a cause of an infection in an individual. Is that right?
That's right. I chaired that IMT.
Yeah. Now, one of the issues here, I think, is that you think it was a false positive that had been found in the case of this individual. Is that right?
That's correct.
According to the material we have, Dr. Sastry, who was the treating clinician, disagreed with that conclusion and in fact went on and treated the individual for Cryptococcus successfully. So could you be wrong about it?
No.
No, he's wrong.
No. So you never take a diagnostic test without the context. During the IMT, the clinician that was present was Dermot Murphy, who said that there's no evidence that this patient had Cryptococcus was being treated as such. The risk-benefit of having a positive antigen test, cryptococcal antigen test, with a patient who did have a fever is such that you would use antifungal treatment while the diagnosis was being settled upon.
And there had been some initial positive tests, is that right?
The cryptococcal antigen test was positive. It was positive at neat, as we would say. So that means you would normally do is then you would dilute, i.e. you would teeter out the antigen such that you would find out at what teeter you no longer get reactivity. Now, in an invasive cryptococcal illness, you will be able to teeter the antigen out several hundredfold, at least 10, 50, if it's cryptococcal meningitis, sometimes even 2,000-fold. Now, that's a surrogate marker about how much Cryptococcus is within the system. In this case, the latex antigen agglutination test did not teeter. So what we had is a positive antigen test that could not be teetered out. So if there was Cryptococcus there, it was at a very low level. Invasive Cryptococcus does not generally, and if you look at the literature, it's all HIV literature, but in an invasive cryptococcal illness will have an antigenemia that will teeter out somewhere between, at its low, somewhere between 10 and 50. That would be for an asymptomatic cryptococcal antigenemia. In disease, that's much higher. So that's where we were in terms of that patient. The patient came in with a neutropenic sepsis of unknown origin and was given broad-spectrum antibiotics. The inflammatory markers that you look for in a patient is called a CRP. The CRP at that time was high, and then over a 4-day period without antifungal treatment, it dropped down to near normal. At the time of antifungal treatment, the CRP had dropped from over 100 down to 17. Below 10 is described as being normal. Invasive cryptococcal disease or infection is not a self-limiting infection. And yet this patient improved, biochemically improved, on a background of no clinical condition showing cryptococcal illness, despite having no antifungal treatment. They had broad-spectrum antimicrobials, but no antifungals. The antifungals were started after a period where this patient had improved biochemically and was showing no clinical signs of cryptococcal illness. No other test that I'm aware of, the CSF, nor cryptococcal DNA analysis showed any evidence of cryptococcus.
If Dr. Sastri's evidence is that this patient was showing signs of cryptococcus, was treated for it and recovered, he's wrong.
Well, there's a difference of opinion.
Are you aware of more recent cases of cryptococcus at the hospital?
No.
It's been suggested there are at least 4 with possible connections to the hospital environment. Do you know anything about that?
I don't.
Should you know anything about it in your capacity?
No. That will go through an infection control route.
I want to take you to one final part of your witness statement before we look at some other things. Page 170 of the witness statement, please. It's an issue that's cropped up with another witness. So I wanted to ask you about it. You see in paragraph 449, where you say Scottish Government is keen that ICDs with experience or expertise in the built environment are part of the planning process. Now, just leaving that hanging short of the practicalities for the moment, would you agree that that's a good idea?
If infection control doctors are going to be embedded into the building process, yes, they need the skills and expertise to inform that process adequately.
Oh, turning it the other way around, if you're building a hospital which may contain many of the most vulnerable patients, should you not have infection control at the heart of that process?
Yeah, I agree.
And your point is essentially that there aren't that many of them about at the moment.
There aren't, and not many of them are willing to take up the role at the moment.
Let me just now leave your witness statement. I'm not going to take you to your supplementary statement, you'll be pleased to know. Can we just look briefly at your sequencing report? And I'm not going to ask you about the technical details of all the technology that goes into producing a whole genome sequencing. Otherwise, we might be here for some time going through the technology. We find this at bundle 6 at page 1195. That's obviously just the heading. Just so I'm quite clear, usually with a medical paper that you see, say, in publications, the first named person is the, as it were, the lead author, and the others are the contributors. Did you tell me earlier, and correct me if I've got it wrong, that in this case, Mr. Brown did most of the work and you contributed?
Yes, I've no analytical skills in terms of sequencing. I deal with the outputs. Mr. Brown has nearly 30 years of experience of manipulating DNA and the expertise to put it all back together again.
Had the lab any experience of sequencing these 3 organisms before this?
No.
And I'm right in thinking that when the materials were being gathered to do the exercise, some isolates were taken from other hospitals as well, a small number, is that right?
That's correct, just to try and add context.
Now, can we just look at 1198? And it may be, given what you've just told us, that you can't help us with this. At 1198, under the general heading of laboratory methods, subheading subculture and storage, the end of that first paragraph there, a single colony was taken to the purity plate and inoculated into, and then there's a description of what was done next. Now, is a single colony enough? Or do you not know?
Yes, a single colony is enough. There is a narrative which I've never heard before until this inquiry that you need 30 picks. That is nothing. That's something that my clinical scientists have never heard before. We went back to the originator of that statement and asked for a reference, and the originator of that statement clearly said that this was a statistical analysis given to her by a statistician from HBA. HBA hasn't been in existence for 13 years. She has no longer any of the calculations and couldn't remember the assumptions that were made on it. And it was only for Legionella. If that assumption was true, it's not confirmed by the data in this piece of work, such that I would reference, if it was 1 in 30, I'd reference clade 6 in the Stenotrophomonas, where we have got 7 closely clustered Stenotrophomonas from the basement water tanks, which are genetically quite close. If the statement that you need 30 picks to show any association was true, then that 7 clade grouping is a 1 in 21 billion chance of happening, which is 30 to the power of 7. And that is not reasonable.
I think I understand the general point that you're making. I think that the question is really focused around, if you simply take 1, should you not take a number? Whether it's 20 or 30 or 10 or 6, it probably doesn't matter. So
we looked at that, and within the sequencing report, we sequenced all of the organisms. In this report, we did Stenotrophomonas, but we've done exactly the same with Cuprivadis. It's just we did that after this report was written, and we show that those organisms, when they come out from a single outlet or a single sample, are clonal. And so that in itself is why I'm very comfortable that 1 pick is enough. The other thing is, if you need more picks, this is very expensive and quite complex technology. If you were to exponentially increase that by however multiple you want to have, first off, it becomes unwieldy, becomes very costly and difficult to do. Lastly, every whole genome sequence study I know has always taken 1 pick. If you need more than 1 pick, it invalidates almost a whole literature base based on no evidence that I'm aware of, no reference that I'm aware of that you need that, except for the assertion that that be the case.
On page 1211, and I've not much more to ask about this. You've got here, you're talking about Enterobacter, which is one of the organisms. In fact, I think Pseudomonas, there wasn't enough material to form a view. That's why it's 3 organisms rather than 4. Is that right?
Indeed.
But here, in terms of Enterobacter, you've got 42 isolates, 7 clinical isolates, 6 environmental isolates from 2018, 2019.
29 clinical isolates Is that not in line 2?
Sorry, the first seven was from GRI, you're quite right. That's from a different hospital.
Yes, indeed, sorry.
And 29 from 24 patients. Looking at the environmental isolates, given the issues that we've been hearing about the water system, is 6 environmental isolates enough to say you've got something representative?
Oh, no, and I very clearly, we say that in the limitations of this report. We do not see Enterobacter in the potable water. I think there's 6 isolations in over 10,000 samplings over a 5-year period, so it's not in there. If it's in the environment, it would be drain associated, and there is no samples, or very few samples, and for reasons I think were in the supplementary report, where we don't have those isolates. What the pattern does show you is it shows you that there's no point source for Enterobacter. It shows you that there is no successful clone that has, i.e. a superbug, a super Enterobacter in the system, and all the organisms are roughly around about 5,000 SNPs different, equidistance, and so to my mind, that looks like sporadic infections, and that's about all you can say without actually going down and then doing like for Enterobacters. And in I was going to say, in defense of this work, this has never been done before. When we've put the first, not Enterobacter, but when we put the first 10 Stenotrophomonas that we sequenced into the UK dataset, we almost doubled the sequence dataset in the UK. And it's one of the biggest pieces of sequencing work I know within a water system thus far.
Well, let's see if we can come now to the issues that have come from this report. Because as you quite rightly say, we're not having a debate about whether the Illumine machine is a good machine or otherwise. We're talking about what use you make of the materials. Because the proposition that you argue for, as I understand it, is that if you don't find a sufficiently close genetic link between environmental samples and the patient sample, then you can exclude the environment as a source.
So you haven't proved causality?
Well, that's not the question I asked.
Well, I don't. So you
let me just rephrase it.
Yep.
So because I think that there may be 2 different questions. If you're looking, whole genome sequencing is a fantastic idea, particularly if you're looking to find something. Is bug X in that glass of water, or whatever?
Agreed.
And you do your own genome sequencing, and lo and behold, there it is. Tick. The question then is, I would suggest to you, what you do if you don't get that nice simplistic answer. Because one possibility, and I think this is just about what you said, was you have not proved definitively that there was a link between source A or B or C or D, or A, B, C or D, doesn't matter, and the sample. So it's simply you haven't proved it. Or, as I think it's been suggested, your work supports, you can exclude the sources as a source of the infection found in the patient. So it's a slightly more nuanced question. So is it you just haven't proved it? We'll stop. Or is it you can use that evidence to exclude the environment as a source?
You can use, it's the latter, I believe, because you can see there are, so sequencing can be used in many ways. So you've got, exactly as you've said, you're actually looking for direct causality in terms of there's a perfect match, or however you define a perfect match, and we defined it as less than 25 SNPs, we would say that was evidence of transmission. So you can look at a transmission chain, and as you say, if it's there, eureka, that's it, proof. If it's not, then you don't know much, you can't say much about it, then you're into how to prove a negative. The other thing that sequencing can do is it can show you the relationships between organisms, because you're actually sequencing fathers, sisters, mothers, cousins, effectively of bacterial progeny. And you can see whether there is, and I referred to them earlier, as a family. So you can actually see bacterial relationships within that. And I would say that my expectation when I first sequenced the Enterobacter was I was completely surprised at what we found. I was expecting to see a super clone, a clone that was very successful, that had come in early using the graphics from Dr. Engstner and Dr. Peters, that had then multiplied within the water system and was an apex predator, if you like, that survived within that water system. And that's not what we saw. We saw a different relationship such that there was no commonality and they all looked sporadic. So you can actually infer what those relationships are like. And not only that, you can put times on things and how quickly those relationships will change. There's a lot of things you can do with sequencing apart from just that causality. And I would be saying, and I would concur that if there were close families that were reasonably close and you hadn't actually hit the one bug combination that shows causality, I'd say you can't exclude it. But what we have is we have a massively heterogeneous population. Well, they're different. Enterobacter, we've got a massively heterogeneous population that looks sporadic. Stenotrophomonas, we've got a massively heterogeneous population that closes down into what looks exactly like nature. If you're a Stenotrophomonas outside the hospital or Stenotrophomonas inside the hospital, the world looks exactly the same to you. And for Cuprivadis, you've got families and you've clades, and they look stable. So they're very different. So you can actually look at the relationships of these organisms. They can't be put into one homogeneous basket and say they're all behaving similarly. What you have to do is, or what you can do, with whole genome sequencing, is you can drop new infections into the context of what you have as a background. And one of the key limitations to whole genome sequencing is the very first time you see an organism and you sequence it, it's meaningless data. You've got nothing to compare it with. It's just a sequence. Then you get two. Now they're either going to be the same or very different. And as you build up your library of sequences, then you can start contextualizing where these organisms sit and also how they might be. You can look at the molecular, or you can try and understand the molecular epidemiology a lot better. So the more sequences you have, the more background information you have, the more useful it is to you. So I think I'll answer your question. I think you can exclude the environment if you don't see those kind of parameters that you might expect to see, as well as not seeing causality.
just see if I've understood this. You point to the heterogeneous character of, are we talking about the samples from blood, or samples from blood and samples from the environment?
Both. Both. They all fall within the same dendrogram, if you like, the same population.
Now, I think I heard you saying that that is a situation that you would find in the wider environment, the domestic situation in a building in Glasgow.
For many of these organisms, yes. For Stenotrophomonas, which has got the most comprehensive data set, the world of Stenotrophomonas is exactly the world in the QE of your Stenotrophomonas. We see the same subtypes. Every single subtype that has been globally recognized, we can recognize in the QE. Every subtype that has able to form clinical infections, we can see the same subtypes with patient data within them. Every subtype where you see exclusively environmental organisms, but no clinical cases, in the world literature, you see in the QE in exactly the same way. It's a smaller mirror image and a smaller microcosm.
Right. So I did hear you say that. I mean, is this based on knowledge of the literature, knowledge of the subtypes of Stenotrophomonas that have been identified, and matching that with the subtypes that you found in the study, which is the subject of your report?
Yes.
I mean, I take it there has, because I can't immediately see the purpose of it, there has been no whole genome sequencing of the general Glasgow or Scottish environment.
Not that I'm aware of, but we know that those organisms are there. It's just that level of detailed sequencing work has not been done. And I think this is one of the key questions that I would have, is that what proportion or what yeah, let's say proportion. I've forgotten the word I want to say, but the proportion of these organisms you would be exposed to outside in your own domestic water source, or any other domestic water source, or water source within a large building that you may be exposed to, and we all possibly are exposed to, out with the healthcare environment. Now, if you're a Stenotrophomonas, I believe that they're ubiquitous. If it's Cuprivadis, we know for a fact they're in buildings and they are ubiquitous. Enterobacters, depends where you look. Klebsiellas, I would say it depends where you look. And when I say it depends where you look, it depends if you're going down your shower drain or your hand wash basin or your potable water source. But we know that both Cuprivadis and Stenotrophomonas are in the mains water.
And you contrast what you found with what you thought you might find, which was a more closely related group of subtypes.
For Enterobacters, yes, I fully expected to see a super aggressive, well adapted key pathogen, key organism that had got a selective growth advantage against its competitors in the environment it was in, and it grew, and there was a clonal expansion of that population. And in some ways, that would be much easier if it was the case, because we would then, you don't want to be sequencing every single organism, so you'd look at this super apex pathogen, if you like, and you say, what is its attributes? Has it got something that we can recognize within the diagnostic laboratory, i.e. an antibiotic resistance, which we can argue about whether that's appropriate or not, or a test, and I'm going back years, when we had MRSA in the Western Infirmary, I'm going back to the 90s, we could tell just by looking at it, because it grew slightly differently, so we got very attuned to it. And if you saw that, and you knew that you were seeing that particular clone in patients, then it would inform decisions that you could make about your response, i.e. this is one that we need to take very seriously. We know this has got a propensity to transmit and to cause infection, and so we have to take quite aggressive interventions to prevent that happening. We didn't see that. We saw a homogeneous, heterogeneous population that seems to, a different organism infects, and I'm talking about Enterobacter, a single person at a time, and they're genetically very different through a homogeneous and heterogeneous background.
If we take the example of Stenotrophomonas, do different subtypes have a different propensity to infect?
It looks like that's the case. That's certainly what the literature will suggest, and that we have seen that in our own data set as well. So not all Stenotrophomonas are the same. Some look like they have got genes or the adaptive ability that when they enter the body can survive, multiply, and cause infections. Others don't seem to have that ability.
No, carry on.
So the second question that you would ask of that data set, if you wanted to research it, is then you'd look at a whole genome sequence analysis where you would find the genes of your environmental organism, your infective organisms, see what genes are different, and see whether you can actually explain. It's called GWAS, but see if you can explain in terms of the genes and whether they carry virulence characteristics that allow one to infect more so than the other. And then you can get quite sophisticated about, and I'm going into university academic departments here, about why that might be the case. So there's many years of research that you could do with this. We've seen it with Stenotrophomonas. I've got no reason to believe that that wouldn't be the same, or potentially the same, for any other environmental organism that could infect a patient, because they need the machinery, the genetic machinery, to allow them to do it.
Would I be right in thinking there's no necessary relationship between the more infective subtype and the frequency that you encounter at the subtype? Now, I don't know if I'm making my question clear.
I know exactly what you mean. No, they're independent, but unfortunately, the most frequent subtype, SM6, in the world literature, is also the most frequent subtype in the QE, and that is one of the infective families. So it's the most prevalent. Although every one of the 23 subtypes of Stenotrophomonas are representative in the QE.
And you designated that MS6?
MS6 is its designation. Yes, my lord.
Thank you.
In the way that things tend to do, phrases emerge from scientific documents which are expressed in much more lay language. The phrase that seems to emerge from your work is "nothing was going on." And I think you mentioned that in the context of one of the IMTs where you say you wanted to do some work to show that nothing was going on. And that phrase has been repeated elsewhere. So I want to give you the opportunity of understanding what you're saying by that.
So I wanted to do the work to see if there was transmission, and if there was transmission, what that transmission would look like. The sequencing work does not confirm that there is evidence of direct transmission from the environment to the patient. And that's as far as you can take the sequence. I wouldn't say that there was nothing going on. We know that if you take the antibiotic stewardship proposal, something's going on because we are selecting out by use of antibiotics these organisms. Doesn't mean to say that these organisms, no, there is no direct evidence that these organisms are coming from the environment, except for they are in the environment. And the assumption that has been made is that because they're in the environment and they're in the patient, they are the same organisms. And that is not what the evidence shows. In fact, in no instance where we have done any sequence in those three organisms is there any evidence, apart from one case, which is called the 2016 aseptic unit case, that there is evidence of direct transmission from the environment to the patient. Now, either we've missed it from despite the tens of thousands of water samples we've taken, or it doesn't happen as described.
And that's why the long version of "nothing was going on" that you've just given us has been promulgated, because the effect of what you're saying is that all these concerns about the environment, the Queen Elizabeth, the water and so on, the things that stopped when interventions were taken, that none of that matters because you haven't been able to prove any link.
I'm not sure that none of it matters. I wouldn't put it that way. I would state that where you have evidential data that would show whether there's transmission or no transmission, the data shows that there is no evidence of transmission as it stands within that data set. I wouldn't be quite so, I wouldn't say that there's nothing going on. Or I'm saying that the data shows that there's no evidence of direct transmission between the environment and the patient.
That's helpful. Can I ask you about biofilms?
Yes, yes.
All right. I know why you make a face, because you made comments on them, and I'm simply trying. I'm going to ask you about them now to avoid picking them up in various bits of your evidence.
Before we go on to what sounds like a slightly different topic, just really wonder if I've taken an accurate note of what Professor Leanord said. Talking about the absence of match, I've noted you as saying either it doesn't happen or we haven't found it. Now, I just wondered if I got that right. Did you say it doesn't happen, or did you say it hasn't happened?
It hasn't happened within this data set.
Right.
But at some point, you are trying to prove a negative, and at some point, if your hypothesis is not if there's no data to support your hypothesis, you either have to keep going, so you're into the land of diminishing returns, or you have to question whether your hypothesis was right in the first place.
Yes, you're not saying that an environmental, a potential pathogen of which there are many examples within the water system in the hospital somehow cannot be a source. What you're saying is your work has not demonstrated that it has been a source.
For these three organisms, and that's another caveat. Some of the organisms, for instance, Elizabeth Kingii, I think there was 3 cases. We never saw that in the water system, but the value of sequencing that is limited, because you could get 3 sporadic sequence pieces of data, and as mentioned before, that was exactly the reason why we can't make any inferences out of Pseudomonas, except for they were different, but we've got can't say anything further than that. That would be overstretching the interpretation of the data.
So the data relates to the 3 organisms that we've talked about.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that leads me nicely into biofilms. Now, I'm going to, where I've picked up what you've said about it, I'm going to give the passages, I'm going to quote the page numbers and so on, so that the records have that. It'll make life easier for anyone reading them later. And the first thing you say, you're not an expert on biofilms, which is at para 285 on page 131. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm not an expert in biofilms.
But would you accept, generally speaking, that they can be complex communities?
That's my understanding, yes.
And would it therefore follow that what may or may not have built up in a water system, which we've had some evidence wasn't dealt with in the way that would ideally have been done over a period of possibly 4 years, you couldn't tell us what kind of biofilms may have built up in that over that period?
No, unfortunately not, although I've got a fridge full of pipework that is to be looked at to see if we can answer that question.
What you do say in your witness statement is you say this serious contamination of a water system would produce a range of biofilms. That's at para 289 on page 132. So I think I've got the quote almost exactly right. So that's your position.
If I think the direct question to me in my question answer was, what would a serious contamination of the water system look like? And it would, to my mind, these organisms would live in biofilms there. That's what they do.
The reason I think you were asked about that is that there may be a difference between perhaps the kind of biofilm that builds up in an individual tap near the exit to the tap, where you have a debate about organisms that need oxygen and so on and so forth, and what may or may not have built up in the depths of a complex system over a period of years. Is that a fair point?
Yes, I can't disagree.
Yeah. And even if you're dealing with an individual tap, one of the points you make in your statement is that sometimes you can have a predominant organism, but different things may be shed at different times, so you can get more than one organism from one source.
Yes, you might, but it's also clear that from the Stenotrophomonas data that where you get a resident strain, that resident strain looks like it's got primacy within that outlet, and it stays there for weeks.
I was simply quoting from paragraph 207 on page 115.
Oh yes, no, absolutely. There's many things that can happen with biofilms.
Yeah. Now, if we then move from biofilms to some of the issues that arise when you're doing environmental sampling generally, if you're taking, for instance, as you suggested you could swab this desk or computer, I hate to think, computer type set, you have to get your aim is to transfer the biological content onto a swab. And we've had some evidence that you're unlikely to get the whole biological content of what's on the surface onto the swab. Is that fair?
Yeah, Nobel's rule of tenths.
Sorry, what was that?
It's called Nobel's rule of tenths.
Right. And
So you'll get a tenth every time you use that swab. You'll get a tenfold reduction in the bacteria. So if you swab the desk, so if there's 1,000 bacteria in your area that you swab, you'll pick up 100 in your swab, and then you take that swab and you put it onto your agar plate. You'll get 10. It's a rule of thumb called Nobel's rule of tenths.
Thank you very much. And presumably, if you're trying to make sense of a complex water system, like we've been told the hospital has, you can only ever it is a true question of sampling. You're taking some water samples from a particular location, but you don't know how they relate to anywhere else, other than perhaps if you're taking them from a tank which is stationary.
Either tank, well, yeah, or post-flush. Post-flush sampling will sample water that's further into the system. So there is a way of doing that rather than just pre-flush.
So His Lordship understands what process you're just telling us about. Can you just explain what that is?
So there's standard SOPs that are used by our water contractors on how to take a sample. You can do what's called a pre-flush, which means that you're really just using you have to take the tap out of, or the outlet out of use for a couple hours. The idea being that if there's any organisms within the mechanism of the tap, they will be there, and then you take your sample, and that tells you what's in that water sample, quite close to the outlet. I think I'm no expert in this, but the engineers will tell you that will be probably the last 2 meters of your outlet. The alternative way of doing it is that you flush the tap and you let the water run through, and you stop the tap, and that's got rid of any, if you like, localized organisms, and then you test the water that has been further into the system because you've let a significant water draw through, and that tells you the health of the system per se, if you like. And so that's one of the fundamental differences about how to test the water.
Does the rule of 10 apply to samples taken from water?
No, because you've captured them within your whatever volume you've taken, and the way water testing occurs is that you then take that water, put it through a vacuum of which there is a filter. The vacuum draws all the water through that filter, and the organisms are then deposited on the filter, and you culture that filter. So everything that would be in whatever volume it is, 1 mil or 100 mil, would be captured. So Nobel's rule only applies to either hard surfaces or, well, it only applies to where you're using a swab.
Thank you.
And when you were doing the process of gathering the material for your WGS report, I think the phrase that's used in the report is serendipity, which we've come across already today. That there was to some extent it was a question of luck and what you could actually find. Yeah. Is that right?
It's more than luck. And that's one of the limitations of a retrospective piece of work like this. You would never design this as a fully funded grant study. You would have a number of other things going on. You can only sequence what has been stored. So again, in terms of serendipity, if it hasn't been stored, we can't sequence it. We find that with Enterobacter, for instance. It doesn't mean to say it completely invalidates some of our conclusions, but that's the nature of a retrospective study. The advantage of having this data set is that going forwards in the future, if there are, or in any data set, if there are future infections, you can contextualize them about where they sit within the molecular epidemiology of these organisms.
And in fact, as a matter of routine housekeeping, many environmental swabs and so on are discarded because otherwise the labs would be overwhelmed by the need for storage.
Absolutely, and that's the nature of microbiology labs.
When I'm going through this exercise, I am acknowledging, just so it's clear to you, that, and I won't call it up on the screen, at page 1230 of the actual report, there's a heading, Limitations of the Analysis, in which many of these points are acknowledged. And in fact, that was one of the issues, that a lot of the environmental samples had not been saved.
Yes, but I will give credit to Dr. Inkster insofar as in March 2018, she asked the environmental lab to do two things, which I think was very prescient, which was to identify all gram-negatives, not just the target ones, because we would look for a target pathogen, but all gram-negatives were to be identified and saved, and from the water samples. So from then on, we had an excellent repository, archive, if you like, to go back and do this work. Without that piece of foresight, this work wouldn't have been possible.
And one of the other issues that arises, as I understand it, is that when a sample is taken, it's then grown on, but generally only a single colony, a single item is then retained, so that at the time when you're doing your exercise, you don't know what else grew on the plate.
Exactly, yes. I mean, although if there were 3 pathogens on that plate, they would save the 3 pathogens. But then we get back into the do you need multi-picks or not, which we've discussed.
So I'm going to have to come back to some general points. We still have a situation in which a group of very highly respected clinicians are saying, we ain't seen this before. You know, this is very different to our experience. You know, clinicians who are otherwise not being subject to any criticism, as far as I'm aware, in this inquiry to date, very highly regarded people. And you're getting similar reactions. For instance, Dr. Mathers, who gave evidence to the inquiry earlier, said this was quite different from any experience he'd ever encountered. And that's a view shared by some others as well. So these are all people who are identifying something unusual, something that is out with their extensive experience. Dr. Harvey Wood was the same. She'd had 40 years. She'd never seen some of these things. I'm not quite sure the extent to which you're saying they're all wrong.
I'm not saying they're wrong. What I'm saying is that the data doesn't support an evidential link of direct transmission from the hospital environment to the patient.
For the 3 organisms?
For the 3 organisms.
I suppose it still raises the question, if you've got a very experienced group who spend all their time, particularly the clinicians, looking for infections because they're terrified of them. Mm-hmm. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but they're worried about them because of patient safety. Why are they suddenly encountering this if it's not explicable in some way? So, are you able to help us?
I'll just go back to, I think this is multifactorial. I think there's elements here that will explain some of that. I don't think you can completely, and I don't discount the build environment as an issue. I have got no data on some of the organisms that are less frequent. I've mentioned Elizabeth kingi, for instance, and I can't definitively give you an answer to the question you've raised. What I can say is that when you look at the organisms that have got the highest number and therefore the greatest effect in any epicurve, Stenotrophomonas, Klebsiella, there's not Klebsiella, we haven't typed, Enterobacter and Cuprovidus, which caused issue. There's no direct evidence that it came from that building. They can still be environmental. We know that these are ubiquitous environmental organisms, but that's not what the data shows.
Your suggested route for much of this infection is endogenous.
For some of the organisms, yes.
I suppose that the question then is, if what was being seen was a burst of endogenously originated infections, first of all, would the clinicians not recognize that? And secondly, would they not have seen it regularly?
Yeah, and my supposition is that that's not what that only explains part of this. And I think that one of the conundrums about this occurrence is that we may never know what the source is or source was. And we've talked about this earlier, that sometimes you just do not know. And I cannot give you a definitive answer. If I could, we may not be sitting here.
I suppose that the other possibility, which I need to ask you about, leaving aside the idea that if it was endogenous, it would be a constant, subject to your point about antibiotic spikes, is that we know from investigations done by an expert group on the water system, including people within GGC, people out with GGC, and so on and so forth, that widespread contamination of the whole water system was found and drastic action was taken to deal with that. At the same time as these issues are arising, and does that not suggest a possible link between the two rather than a coincidence?
I don't think you would have to investigate that is a possible link, and that's exactly what GGC did. And this work here was trying to understand what that link might look like from a molecular point of view.
Just coming back to the study for a moment, if you have an organism of concern, and let's leave aside for the moment the analysis of whether each clade is capable of causing infection or not. If you have a series of samples which show from the environment, which show an organism of concern, let's say you have a number of these, but the sample from the patient isn't closely connected genetically by the definition you use. You say that notwithstanding the existence of all these organisms of concern, there is no connection, and that's that. End of investigation.
So I would go back to say that I would use the tools that we have to try and understand where the context of that organism. I don't think that you would say. So the unknown in this, I'll go back. The unknown in this is what, if any, contribution does the normal environmental organisms out with healthcare play in infections that are identified. And one of the things that we don't know, and we touched on it, and I'll raise it with Stenotrophomonas, is that you said you ingest it. Yes, well, we do, and that's why when you select it out, that's why it's in your oropharynx. What we don't know is at what level it's there. If it's in us, every single time I take a drink of water, do I reacquire Stenotrophomonas? And it does me no harm because I'm not immunosuppressed. Or if I have one of these organisms, if it stays with me and becomes part of my, if you like, normal flora, certainly in the oropharynx, where you get some of the highest densities of bacteria in your body, we do not know or fully understand that. We talked about the microbiome. We're starting to understand that a wee bit more. So I can't answer your question definitively because I don't think the data is out there to help us answer that question. You would say there's an association, but there's not causality.
Yeah, I think in the kind of example that I gave you, someone like Professor Dancer would say, no, you don't assume since there's no link in the samples you found, therefore there's no connection. You might keep looking.
And I agree, you might keep looking and you might never find.
I think we probably have an easy consensus that if you're trying to find an organism and you do whole genome sequencing, tick the box, that's fine, you find the organism.
Agreed.
I think the question is how far you use the failure to find the link as excluding, as opposed to simply saying that it's not been proved.
So I agree with that supposition as well. What, in that situation, you're not relying wholly on whole genome sequencing. What you're relying on is your sampling structure before the whole genome sequencing. Your sampling structure would in effect be your net that you would catch those organisms within that would then allow you to sequence and give you a yes/no answer. If you've got either a very narrow sampling structure, you have got the potential to miss something. And I mean narrow both in terms of geographical, either time, geography, or what you define it as. GGC is one of the most sampled healthcare systems that I am aware of, with tens of thousands of samples over, well, we're talking about 5 years, but now 7 years that we've had, that really, it's been under scrutiny like no other system before. As far as, in my opinion, that is a very wide net to spread. If there was organisms there, they're not difficult to grow. They would grow, and we would then sequence the outputs of that growth and come to some sort of conclusion about whether it was valid to state that that organism came from that building and that water system or not. And did it look like that organism in that patient that was in that building or not? So it's not the sequencing that would give you that answer. It's your surveillance structure and your sampling structure prior to the sequencing.
I'm just wondering, and maybe you can help me with this, if you if you adopt the approach that you're suggesting, which is you're looking for this causal connection, if you don't find it, nothing to do with the environment, does that impact on the steps that might be taken by, for instance, an IMT trying to look at something? Because we've already heard examples of where somebody has taken precaution X or precautions X, Y, and Z, as you would say, and lo and behold, things improve.
So no, I think the IMT would take exactly the same precautions. Another limitation of whole genome sequencing is that whole genome sequencing is effectively after the fact. So unless even if you gave me a bug today, I won't give you an answer for 4 weeks, and that's just the nature. Well, 2 weeks is the best we can do. But if you were in if your bug was in a freezer, that's 4 weeks. So, and the first organism, and even the second and the third and the fourth, don't give you much information. What gives you the information is the background, your library, your archive of sequences. So you really need, once you have that archive of sequences, you can build up a molecular epidemiological narrative. So it doesn't help you at the initial part of an IMT unless you have your archived sequences to relate back to when you get an organism. In many ways, that's going to be impractical. If you've got, and I'll go back to the 3 Elizabeth Kingii, I don't know how many years that would take to collect that archive. You can get national and international repositories, so you can compare them, but it doesn't look like your home molecular epidemiology. So that's an issue. It's no accident that we have taken the big numbers here, because that's the ones that we knew would be there, and we can actually make some inferences, imperfect as they may be, on the molecular epidemiology within the hospital.
The use of the absence of genetic closeness to exclude, as opposed to simply say not proved. Can you help us? Is there any other published material we should look at which supports that proposition?
For Stenotrophomonas and cystics, I know of one paper that looked at, I think, 90 odd Stenotrophomonas types and compared environmental, I think, well, it was 90 environmental and I can't remember how many patients, and they concluded exactly that. There was no linkage, despite it looking like an outbreak had occurred in the same way as we're having a discussion here. Now, that's unusual because there's publication bias in the journals, where a journal will take a piece of work that gives an affirmative answer more readily than a piece of work that takes a non-affirmative answer. And that's recognized. So there's a publishing bias, and there's also the authorship bias. If you've shown nothing, it's harder to write your paper and say nothing was shown and to get that accepted. But I know of one case, I don't know the literature, I haven't gone through the literature systematically, but if it helps this inquiry, we can dig that reference out. I only know of it, I'm familiar with it, I'm not expert on it.
I don't think I have any further questions at this stage for this witness blog.
Professor Leanord, what I must do is discover if there are other questions in the room. So I'll ask you to go back to the witness room, maybe 10 minutes or thereby, and I'll be able to tell you whether there's more questioning. Thank you.
Thanks,
Mr. Cole?
Well, a number of issues have arisen from this evidence, but none give rise to questions to be asked today.
Right. I understand, Professor, there are no further questions for you this afternoon, and that means you're free to go. But before you go, can I thank you for your attendance today? But can I also thank you for the work that has gone into preparing for that evidence, including the preparation of the witness statement. I'm grateful for that, and thank you for that. But as I say, you're now free to go.
Thank you, Your Lordship.
Right. You say there's things arising from the evidence, but nothing that needs to be
Done now.
done
No.
present.
No.
Well, we shall resume tomorrow at 10 o'clock, I think, with the evidence of Dr. Armstrong. Yeah.
Yes.
Present.